The crack of his hand across her face silenced 300 soldiers. Not because it was brutal. They'd seen brutal. Not because she cried. She didn't. She stood there, cheek red, tray shattered on the floor, food splattered across her boots, and she looked at the man who hit her the way a surgeon looks at a scalpel. Calm, precise. Like she was deciding exactly what to do with him. Sergeant Victor Kane laughed. The room laughed with him. Nobody noticed the insignia that slipped from her torn sleeve and landed face up on the tile. Nobody except the private who picked it up and went completely pale. If this story keeps you watching, hit follow, drop a like, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The lunch rush at Fort Redstone peaked at 12:40 every weekday, and it was ugly. 300 soldiers in various states of exhaustion funneled through 2 serving lines inside the main dining facility, what everyone called the DFAC. While the kitchen staff fought a losing battle against the noise, the heat, and the sheer volume of people who needed to be fed and back at their posts within 40 minutes. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed at a frequency that felt personal. The floor, waxed every morning at 0500, was already filmed with tracked-in mud and spilled coffee by noon. The ventilation system roared and accomplished nothing except circulating the smell of overcooked green beans and institutional gravy to every corner of the room. It was a Tuesday. Nobody remembered Tuesdays for anything good. Maya Cross arrived at 12:43, which meant the lines were long and the good food, if you could call any of it that, was already picked over. She'd spent the morning in the logistics annex on the north end of the base, cross-referencing equipment manifests for a supply rotation that wasn't technically due for 3 weeks, but that someone upstairs had decided needed to be audited immediately. She had spent 4 hours staring at serial numbers and saying nothing to the 2 other clerks in the room, which was about how most of her mornings went. She was small, 5'2" on a generous day, narrow across the shoulders, with the kind of face that people looked at and immediately filed under non-threatening. Her uniform was clean but unremarkable. No awards rack, no combat patch on the right shoulder, no air assault badge or anything else that might prompt a second glance. She wore her hair pinned back tightly enough to avoid any regulation issues and kept her sleeves rolled to exactly the prescribed length. Nothing about her announced anything. She picked up a tray at the end of the line and moved into the queue. The DFAC, at lunch, operated on an unspoken social physics that every soldier understood without being told. Rank clustered with rank. Units moved in loose packs. The tables near the windows were claimed by the guys who'd been there longest, and everyone else arranged themselves accordingly. Maya ate alone, usually at a table near the back wall, close to the emergency exit and far from the television mounted in the corner that played sports highlights. Nobody was watching. She was 3 people from the front of the serving line when it happened. A hand came down hard on her shoulder from behind. Not a tap, not an excuse me, but the kind of grip that meant move. And she turned to find Sergeant First Class Victor Kane standing behind her with 2 men from his platoon flanking him like furniture. Kane was built like someone had assembled him from spare parts designed for intimidation. 6'1", 220, with a jaw that jutted forward when he talked, and the permanent expression of a man whose personal timeline of grievances stretched back further than anyone wanted to hear about. He'd been at Redstone for 11 months, which was just long enough to know exactly which spaces he owned and exactly who was allowed to be in them. "You jumped the line," he said. Maya glanced at the people in front of her. A specialist she didn't know, a corporal she recognized from the motor pool, and then back at Kane. "I didn't. I came in through the east entrance and queued from the back. I've been standing in this line for 10 minutes. He said it like it closed the argument. Then you came in after me." One of the guys flanking Kane, a corporal named Reyes with a fresh haircut and not a lot of operational experience showing yet, let out a short laugh, the kind that's more reflex than actual amusement, like he'd learned that laughing when Kane spoke was good for his immediate future. Kane's jaw pushed forward. "You smart-mouthing me, specialist? I'm explaining what happened. I don't need an explanation. I need you to move." The line had stopped. People were watching. Not conspicuously, not all at once, but in the way soldiers watch things that might escalate. Sidelong, cautious, calculating whether this was entertainment or something they needed to be clear of. Someone set their tray down without picking up food. Someone else took a half step backward. Maya didn't move. Not because she was being defiant in any theatrical way. She just stood there, the same way she'd been standing there before Kane arrived, tray in hand, facing forward, waiting for the line to move. Kane's hand shot out and caught the edge of her tray. What happened next took maybe 2 seconds. He yanked the tray sideways and let go at the same time, sending it spinning. The plate of food, Tuesday's special, some kind of pasta with a red sauce that had been sitting under the heat lamp too long, flew off in a wide arc and splattered across the front of Maya's uniform. The tray hit the floor with a crash that cut through the DFAC noise like a gunshot, and the room, not all at once, but quickly, went from loud to listening. Red sauce on the green uniform. Food across her boots. Tray still rocking on the tile. Kane stood with his arms crossed, the smirk already forming. The laughter started at the tables nearest the serving line and moved outward in a wave. The kind of group laughter that doesn't require anything to actually be funny, just requires someone with rank to have established that this was the mood. Reyes laughed. The other corporal laughed. Half a dozen soldiers at the nearest table laughed, and a few of them didn't even know what had happened. They just matched the room. Maya looked down at her uniform. She set the now empty tray on the rack to her left with a precise, unhurried movement, like she was completing a task. Then she looked back at Kane. Her face was still. Not the stillness of someone suppressing panic. Not the stillness of someone calculating their options. The stillness of someone who had already finished calculating and was now simply waiting for the appropriate moment. It was the kind of stillness that was different from calm. And the difference was something most people in the room couldn't have named, but a few of them felt somewhere low in the back of their minds. "You're going to want to document that," she said quietly. Quiet enough that Kane had to lean slightly forward to hear it. "What did you just say to me?" "I said you're going to want to document it. Because someone else will." He stared at her for a moment. Then he did something that nobody later could explain the impulse behind. He reached back and slapped her across the face. Open palm, full force, no restraint. The sound of it cracked through the room, and the laughter stopped like someone had thrown a switch. The dining facility went completely silent. The fluorescent lights kept buzzing. The kitchen exhaust fans kept running. Somewhere behind the serving line, a ladle hit the side of a metal pan, and the sound rang out, small and absurd in the silence that followed. Maya's head moved with the impact. She wasn't a statue, she wasn't made of stone, but she came back to center immediately and looked straight at Kane. Her cheek had gone red. Her eyes hadn't changed. She touched her cheek with 2 fingers, not checking for damage, more like confirming coordinates. Then she said, barely above a whisper, "Protocol breach recorded." "The hell does that mean?" Kane said, but something in his voice had shifted slightly. Not much, just enough. "It means what it means." He laughed, but it came out shorter than he intended. He turned to Reyes and the other corporal. "Get her out of here." Both men moved at the same time. What happened next was over before most people in the room fully registered it had begun. Reyes reached for her left arm. The other corporal, his name was Dodd, 23 years old, 6 months post-AIT, went for her right shoulder. Maya's response wasn't a sequence of dramatic movements. It was more like a single continuous adjustment, the way water moves around an obstacle. Her left arm rotated inward as Reyes grabbed it, using his own grip as a pivot point, and then she stepped into the angle rather than away from it. The joint lock she applied took Reyes's wrist, elbow, and shoulder simultaneously and dropped him to one knee in a single motion where he stayed, not because he was unconscious, but because moving would have broken something. Dodd's hand never made contact. His forward momentum met a controlled redirect that put him off balance, then a compressed restraint around his neck from behind. Not a blood choke, not a windpipe press, just enough occlusion to freeze him completely. And he sank to his knees with Maya's forearm positioned in a way that made it physically impossible for him to move without her permission. She held it for 2 seconds. Then she released him, stepped back, and stood exactly where she'd been standing. Reyes was on the floor. Dodd was sitting back on his heels, breathing carefully. Neither of them was seriously hurt. The whole thing had taken approximately 4 seconds. The DFAC was the quietest it had ever been. Kane stared at her. His mouth had opened slightly, and he hadn't corrected it. Behind him, a sergeant he'd known for 3 years was standing very still with an expression that Kane couldn't read and didn't want to. Maya reached down and picked up her tray from the rack where she'd set it. She turned back toward the serving line as if she intended to simply get another plate of food. "What are you?" Kane said. His voice had a different texture now. Not afraid. He wouldn't have said afraid, not to himself, not to anyone, but something adjacent to it. She didn't answer immediately. She set the tray on the rail and looked at the server, a private named Ogden who was holding a ladle and staring at her with an expression between awe and terror. "Just the pasta," she said to Ogden. "Not too much sauce." She turned back to Kane then, and what she said was quiet enough that only the people closest heard it clearly. "You don't need to know what I am. You needed to know not to do that. Those are two different problems, and only one of them is still fixable." Kane's hand moved. He wasn't conscious of it. He reached for her torn sleeve, the fabric that had been pulled loose when Reyes grabbed her, and as he yanked it, the sleeve tore the rest of the way open from elbow to wrist. The marking on her forearm was visible for approximately 3 seconds before she lowered her arm. That was long enough. It wasn't a tattoo. It was more like a designation, a series of characters that weren't quite letters, arranged in a configuration that didn't correspond to any standard military identifier that anyone in that room had seen before. Silver black, embedded with a precision that suggested something more deliberate than ink. Private Tomas Arliss, 20 years old, 3 months at Redstone, standing near the napkin dispensers with his lunch tray clutched in both hands, saw it most clearly. His face did something complicated. His tray lowered slightly, like he'd forgotten he was holding it. Kane saw his expression and turned back to Maya. "That thing on your arm. What about it? What unit is that?" "It's not a unit designation." "Then what is it?" She pulled her sleeve down, smoothing the torn fabric as much as it would smooth. "It's administrative." "Administrative." He repeated it like the word itself was an insult. "You're a logistics clerk. I've seen your assignment paperwork." "You've seen paperwork," she said. "That's not the same thing." Kane was about to respond. Something was forming on his face, some recalibration of aggression, a pivot from embarrassment to renewed authority, when the base alarm system activated. Not the training alert, which was 2 short tones and a recorded announcement. Not the weather alert, which nobody ever took seriously. This was the full emergency activation, a sustained wail that penetrated the DFA sea walls and vibrated in the chest cavity. Red indicator lights mounted near the exits began cycling. Everyone moved instinctively, soldiers standing, trays going down, hands reaching for radios and phones. And in the motion and noise, a voice cut through on the MP frequency that 3 different soldiers in the room happened to have live on their belt radios. "All units, command element inbound to DFAC main. Stand by for senior officer access. This is not a drill. Repeat, not a drill." The doors at the east end of the DFAC opened. Military police came in first, 4 of them, moving in a tight stack and fanning to cover the room with the practiced efficiency of people who'd been briefed before entry. Then a lieutenant colonel came through, Hardaway, the base deputy commander, a man who had never once been seen inside the enlisted DFAC in the memory of anyone present. Behind him, a full colonel whose name nobody was certain of. 2 more figures in civilian clothes whose posture suggested they weren't actually civilians. Every soldier in the room who was capable of it came to attention. Hardaway scanned the room with the focused speed of someone who'd been told exactly what he was looking for. His eyes moved through the crowd, past Kane, past the 2 men still recovering on the floor, and found Maya. He stopped. Then Lieutenant Colonel Hardaway walked toward her through a room full of soldiers who parted without being asked. And when he reached her, he came to attention and rendered a salute. A full salute. Held. To a 5'2" logistics specialist with food on her uniform and a red mark on her cheek. The silence in the room went so deep that the buzz of the fluorescent lights was suddenly very loud again. Maya looked at Hardaway for a moment. Then she returned the salute, crisp, exact, the geometry of it slightly different from the standard form, in a way that nobody could quite quantify, but that every career soldier in the room registered somewhere below the level of conscious thought. "Ma'am," Hardaway said, "we received the signal." "I know," she said. "I sent it." Kane's face had stopped being a face. It was just a collection of features that hadn't decided yet what expression to make. "Sergeant Kane," Hardaway said, without looking at him. "Do not move from that position." Hardaway turned back to Maya. His voice dropped, though not so low that the soldiers nearest them couldn't hear every word. "How bad?" He struck a commissioned officer twice, ordered enlisted personnel to physically remove her from the premises. Both made contact. She tilted her head slightly toward Reyes and Dodd, who were now standing again, pale and uncertain. "They followed an unlawful order under duress." "That's relevant." "Yes, ma'am." "The room needs to hear the rest of it." Hardaway glanced around. 300 soldiers standing in various degrees of rigid attention, the ones nearest the front barely breathing. "All of it?" "All of it," she said. "That was the point." Hardaway turned to face the room, and the colonel who had come in behind him moved to his left, which was a subtle indicator of deference that every officer present caught immediately. "At ease," Hardaway said, though no one in the room actually relaxed. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Hardaway. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Deputy Base Commander." A pause. "The officer you're looking at is not a logistics specialist." The room produced no sound. "She was never a logistics specialist. She has been operating here in an embedded capacity for the purpose of a command-directed leadership evaluation. Fort Redstone has been under assessment for the past several weeks. Personnel conduct, command climate, peer treatment of junior personnel. All of it." Another pause. "What happened in this room today is now part of that assessment record. Permanently." Somewhere near the back of the DFAC, someone exhaled. "Sergeant First Class Kane." Kane's jaw was tight. He had the look of a man trying to find a position to stand in that felt defensible and failing. "You struck a commissioned officer, twice. You ordered personnel under your command to physically assault that same officer. You abused your authority in full view of 300 witnesses." Hardaway's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Military police will escort you to the Provost Marshal's office. You will not speak further." 2 of the MPs moved toward Kane, and he went with them. Not fighting it, but not quite cooperative either, the stiff compliance of someone whose mind was still a few seconds behind events. Reyes and Dodd stood very still. The soldiers who had laughed were now looking at their boots, or their food, or the middle distance, anywhere that was not the woman standing at the center of the room. Maya picked up the tray she'd been holding. She looked at it for a second, then set it back down on the rack. Ogden, the server, was still standing behind the line with his ladle. He hadn't moved in 4 minutes. "Private," Maya said. "Ma'am," Ogden said, the word coming out small. "I'll come back tomorrow. The pasta looked good before it ended up on my uniform." Ogden blinked. "Yes, ma'am." And then, before he could stop it, "I'll set some aside." Something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile. Not one either. She turned and walked with Hardaway toward the east exit, the crowd parting completely, and the colonel and the 2 civilian-shaped figures fell in around her, not escorting her so much as orienting around her, the way planets don't escort the sun so much as simply arrange themselves in its vicinity. At the door, she paused without turning around. "Carry on," she said. The door closed. The dining facility stayed silent for another full 30 seconds before anyone moved, before anyone's tray touched a table, before anyone said a single word to anyone else. 300 soldiers standing in a cafeteria that smelled like overcooked green beans, and every one of them thinking some version of the same thing. She knew what she was walking into. She let it happen. She let him do it, and she documented it, and she sent the signal, and she stood there with food on her uniform while he laughed at her, and she was never afraid for a single second of any of it. Private Tomas Arliss was still holding his tray. He looked down at the insignia he'd picked up off the floor earlier. He'd pocketed it reflexively, the way you pick up something that falls without thinking about it. He looked at the silver-black characters on the small piece of Velcro and tried to think about where he'd heard anything like what he'd just seen described. He had, once. A sergeant from his last unit had mentioned it, drunk, 3 weeks before his ETS date, in the way that people say things they've decided they won't be around to be accountable for. There are people who go in places before the mission, not before the mission exists. They go in so far in advance that by the time anyone else arrives, they've already been there long enough to have opinions. You never know they're there. That's the point. You only find out after. Arliss looked at the insignia. Then he looked at the door where she'd gone. He put the insignia in his chest pocket, buttoned the flap, and picked up his fork. At the table beside him, a corporal named Sweeney leaned over and said very quietly, "You gonna eat?" "Yeah," Arliss said. "You okay?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "Not really." Sweeney nodded like that was the correct answer. The DF. AC slowly returned to noise, not the raucous, clattering noise of before, but something lower and more deliberate, conversations starting in fragments and not building too much. Trays moved, food got eaten. People who had been standing at attention found chairs and sat in them. But the tables near the serving line, where Kane had been standing, where two corporals had gone to the floor in 4 seconds, where a woman with food on her uniform had touched her face and said, "Protocol breach recorded," those tables stayed empty for the rest of the lunch hour. Nobody wanted to be where that had happened. Nobody was sure exactly what had happened. That uncertainty would last exactly until 1900 hours, when a communique went out base-wide from the deputy commander's office. A single page, official letterhead, brief enough to read in under 2 minutes, that would make a number of things suddenly, irreversibly clear. But that was 6 hours away. For now, the fluorescent lights buzzed, the kitchen exhaust fans ran, and Private Tomas Arliss ate his lunch in silence with one hand resting on his chest pocket, feeling the small hard edge of the insignia through the fabric. Trying to remember every detail of what he'd seen before, time softened it into something more manageable. He didn't want it softened. He wanted to remember exactly what her face had looked like when Kane hit her. Because she hadn't flinched. She hadn't teared up. She hadn't tensed in the way a person tenses when they're afraid or when they're suppressing something. Her face had done something else. Something he kept turning over and couldn't quite name. It had gone professional. Like someone had flipped a switch inside her, and what came on behind her eyes wasn't anger or humiliation or calculation, but something older and colder and more practiced than any of those things. Something that had looked at the situation and cataloged it and filed it efficiently, without heat. He'd seen it once before. A photograph. In a book about Special Forces operational history. A chapter on personnel who had operated behind lines in conditions that the author described only in the most general terms because the specific terms were still classified. A face in the back of a briefing room in a photo taken in the late 90s. A woman standing against a wall who looked like she'd been edited out of the frame and put back in by accident. The caption had been blacked out. The face in that photo had the same expression Maya Cross had worn when Kane's hand came across her cheek. Arliss ate his pasta. It had gone cold. Somewhere across the base, in the provost marshal's office, Victor Kane was sitting in a plastic chair waiting for a process to begin that would end things he wasn't fully prepared to have ended. And somewhere else, he didn't know where, couldn't guess, wouldn't have been told if he'd asked. The woman who called herself Maya Cross was writing, not a complaint, not a victim's statement, a report. She'd been writing it in her head since 1243. The report she was writing wasn't long. That was the thing about documentation at this level. It wasn't meant to be exhaustive. It wasn't meant to tell a story. It was meant to be precise. Incident time, location, personnel involved, actions taken, outcomes observed. She'd been trained to reduce a room full of chaos to 8 lines of clean language, and she was good at it. And she hated how good at it she was sometimes, because good at it meant she'd done it enough times that the process felt mechanical. And feeling mechanical about things like this meant something she didn't examine too closely on weeknights. The office they'd given her was on the 2nd floor of the command building, a room that was technically a conference space and therefore had a table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard with someone's old briefing notes still on it, and a window that faced east toward the motor pool. She hadn't turned the overhead light on. The window gave enough. She sat at the head of the table with a field notebook open in front of her, actual paper, actual pen, which was a habit she'd never been able to fully transfer to digital, and she wrote in the small, regular hand that she'd developed sometime around her 3rd year in the field, when she'd realized that handwriting under stress got worse, and the only solution was to make the baseline so controlled that stress couldn't degrade it much further. 12:43 hours. DFAC, Maine. Sergeant First Class 5 Kane, 3rd Platoon NCO. Unprovoked physical contact ×2. Directed subordinate personnel to physically remove subject. Both made physical contact. Duration of incident, Approximately 9 minutes. Response, minimum force. No injuries requiring medical. She paused. No injuries requiring medical was true for Reyes and Dodd. It was not entirely true for her cheek, which had swollen along the cheekbone in a way that her tongue kept finding from the inside. But that wasn't going in the report because it wasn't operationally relevant, and because she wasn't interested in it being operationally relevant. She capped the pen and looked out the window. The motor pool was quiet at this hour. Two mechanics she didn't know the names of yet were working on a LMTV with the hood up, moving around each other in the loose way of people who'd worked together long enough to stop narrating their actions. One of them said something. The other one laughed. She couldn't hear it through the glass. She'd been at Redstone for 22 days. 22 days was enough time to build a functional picture of a unit's culture. You watched how people moved through shared spaces. You listened to the way NCOs talked to junior soldiers when they thought no one important was around. You paid attention to who laughed at what, and more importantly, who laughed first. You noted the people who went quiet when a certain senior NCO walked in, and whether the quiet was the respectful kind or the careful kind, and that distinction was everything. Fort Redstone had the careful kind. She'd flagged it in her assessment notes on day 4. By day 11, she had enough pattern data to sketch the rough shape of the problem. By day 19, she'd identified Kane specifically, not as the source of it, but as the expression of it, the visible symptom of something that started higher up and had been running long enough to feel normal to everyone inside it. That was the thing about command climate assessments. The unit never knew it was sick until someone from outside looked at it. And even then, most of them push back because what you're used to doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like how things are. She picked up the pen again and wrote one more line. Recommend full command review, 3rd Platoon NCO structure. See attached personnel observation logs. She closed the notebook. There was a knock at the door. 2 knocks. Specific interval, which was Hardaway's knock and not anyone else's. Come in. He opened the door and stood in the frame rather than entering, which meant he wasn't staying. Jag's been notified. Kane's in processing. Reyes and Dodd have both given statements. They're cooperating. I know, I expected that. Colonel Ferris wants a briefing at 0800 tomorrow. Fine. Hardaway didn't leave. He looked at her cheek. He didn't say anything about it, which she appreciated. There's going to be talk, he said, in the unit. It's already started. There was always going to be talk. Some of it isn't charitable. She looked at him. Some of it never is. That's part of the data. He nodded slowly, like he was deciding whether to say the next thing. He decided to. You could have stopped it earlier. Yes. Second contact. I know. You let him. I know what I let him do, Marcus. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and it landed the way she intended it. Not as a rebuke, but as a door closing. I needed the room to see the full sequence. One contact, they might have explained it down later. Friction. Misunderstanding. He didn't know. 2 contacts with witnesses, with the MPs pulling the camera footage. That's a record that doesn't have a softer interpretation. Hardaway was quiet for a moment. That's cold, he said. Not accusatory, just observational. That's the job. He looked at her for another second and then nodded and stepped back from the door. 0800. I'll be there. He closed the door. She listened to his footsteps go down the hall, down the stairs, then nothing. She turned back to the window. The mechanics had the hood down now. One of them was wiping his hands on a rag that had long since stopped being capable of cleaning anything. That's cold. She knew it was. She'd known it since the moment she sent the embedded activation signal. The silent pulse from the device in her left sleeve, not quite a watch, not quite anything with a civilian name, that had gone out at 12:51 and reached Hardaway's secure receiver in approximately 4 seconds. She'd sent it after the second contact, not the first because one contact wasn't sufficient for the record she needed, and she'd known that going in. That was cold. Marcus was right. She also knew that if she hadn't been the one sitting in that assessment, if it had been someone less equipped to absorb 2 contacts and walk out of it, if it had been a junior soldier, an actual logistics specialist, a person who didn't know how to position against a striking threat, the outcome of those 9 minutes would have been different and worse, and the command review would have been triggered by a medical report rather than a performance record. She knew all of that. It didn't make it not cold. It just made it explicable. She stood, stretched her neck to the left until something released, and went to the whiteboard. She picked up the eraser and cleared half of it, leaving the other half. Whoever had written those notes had a briefing to give eventually, probably, and it wasn't her problem. And she picked up a dry erase marker and wrote one name, Kane. And then, below it, connected by a line, source? She drew a bracket above that line and wrote, Unit History, Transfer Records, Complaint Log, JAG Office 11 months. She capped the marker and looked at what she'd written. Kane didn't originate this. He wasn't smart enough to originate it, and he wasn't senior enough to sustain it. He was a product, efficient, reliable, tolerated, and therefore endorsed. Something above him had been looking the other way for long enough that he'd stopped being careful about it. That meant the looking away was either negligence or consent, and those two things led to very different places. She needed to know which one. Dumped. Thomas Arliss couldn't sleep. This was not unusual for him. He'd had intermittent insomnia since BCT, and his solution was usually to lie in the dark and count backwards from a high number until either sleep came or it didn't. And on the nights it didn't, he got up before reveille and did something useful. But tonight wasn't the normal kind of sleeplessness. Tonight had a specific texture, the kind that comes from having seen something that doesn't fit into any existing framework your brain has prepared, and that your brain therefore keeps returning to in an attempt to file correctly. He was in his bunk in the second-floor bay, surrounded by the irregular sounds of a barracks at night. Someone's phone alarm going off and being silenced immediately. Someone else turning over in their rack with the creak of the frame. The HVAC unit cycling on and off in a rhythm that never quite became predictable. Darkness, mostly, except for the ambient light under the bay door. He had the insignia in his hand. He'd taken it out of his chest pocket when he got back from evening chow, and had been holding it on and off for the past 2 hours. It was a small thing, maybe 2 inches square, black Velcro backing, the silver-black characters on a field that was dark enough to make them hard to read in low light. He'd looked at it under his phone flashlight 3 different times, and the characters were the same each time, which meant he was either memorizing them wrong or they were genuinely unlike anything standard. He thought about Private Yuen from his last unit, who'd done 2 years in an administrative capacity that nobody talked about specifically, and who'd come back from it with a certain quietness that wasn't quite normal quietness. He thought about the things Yuen had said in the cab on the way to his ETS celebration at an Applebee's outside Fort Carson, drunk enough to talk but still precise about what he didn't say. There's paperwork, and then there's the actual record. The actual record doesn't look like paperwork. You'd know it if you saw it, but you'd never see it. Arliss turned the insignia over in his hand. At the bunk across from his, Sweeney was asleep on his back with one arm off the edge of the mattress, his knuckles almost touching the floor. Sweeney could sleep through anything, which Arliss had always considered a gift and never more than right now. The bay door opened. Not slowly, not fast. The particular pace of someone who knew where they were going. Arliss didn't sit up, just turned his head. The ambient light silhouetted a figure that was too short to be most of the men in this bay, and the way the figure moved was different enough from anyone he knew that his hand closed around the insignia before he'd consciously decided to close it. She stopped at the foot of his bunk. "I know you have it," Maya said. Quiet enough to not wake Sweeney. Arliss sat up slowly. He could feel his pulse in his throat. "How did you... You picked it up. I saw you pocket it." She paused. "I wasn't sure you'd still have it. Could have turned it in. Could have thrown it away. I wasn't sure what to do with it." "I know." She didn't say it like an accusation. She said it like a true thing. "Can I have it back?" He held it out. She took it and turned it in her fingers once, then put it in her jacket pocket. She was wearing civilian clothes now. Plain dark jacket, plain dark pants, nothing that marked her as anything. "You're not going to sleep," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment. In the dark, with the light from under the door behind her, he couldn't read her face precisely. "You had a question you didn't ask in the DFAC." His mouth went slightly dry. "A few. One of them." He thought about which one. He had approximately 7, arranged in the order they'd occurred to him during the afternoon, and he'd been cycling through them. He picked the one that had stayed at the front. "Did you know he was going to hit you?" A pause. I knew someone in his position, with his history, presented with that specific provocation, had a statistically high likelihood of physical contact. Yes. So you put yourself there on purpose. To get hit. To get the record, she said. There's a difference. Is there? Another pause, slightly longer. What's your name, Private? Arliss, Tomas. How long have you been at Redstone? 3 months. Before that? Fort Carson, 1 year. And before that, basic at Leonard Wood. He paused. You're not asking because you don't know. Something shifted in the way she was standing. Just slightly, just enough. No, I'm not. You already have a file. I have a lot of files. The HVAC cycled off. In the quiet that followed, Sweeney turned over and made a sound that wasn't words, and they both went still for a moment until his breathing leveled back into the regular rhythm of deep sleep. Maya said, Go to sleep, Arliss. I can't. Try anyway. She turned toward the door. And don't talk about what you saw on my arm. Not yet. Not yet, he repeated. That implies eventually. She stopped with her hand on the door. It implies I don't know yet. And she was gone, the door closing back to its ambient lit line, and Arliss sat in his bunk for another minute with the impression of that conversation trying to locate itself in a category, and failing, and settling for real and happened, and I was awake, which was all he could definitively confirm. He lay back down. He didn't sleep for another hour, but when he finally did, it was the deep kind, sudden and without transition, which was its own answer to something. The Provost Marshal's office at night ran on a skeleton, 2 MPs at the desk, 1 duty officer in the back, the occasional intake that moved through processing with the particular bureaucratic slowness of military justice doing what it did. Kane had been there since 1400. It was now 22:30. He'd been in the holding area for 6 hours with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 3 hours ago and a form he'd already read 12 times. The form explained his rights. He knew his rights. He'd been in the Army for 14 years, and he knew his rights the way he knew the serial number on his weapon, automatically, without needing to think, which meant when he actually tried to think about them right now, they kept sliding out from under him. He kept replaying the thing in the DFAC. Not with regret, exactly. More with the frantic, backward-running quality of a man trying to find the moment where it could have gone differently, and finding it, and then finding that the moment kept moving earlier and earlier the longer he looked. He'd replayed it back to the point where he'd seen her standing in the line and decided she'd cut ahead, and even there, even at the very beginning, there was a version of himself that had been going to do what he'd done, and he didn't know what to do with that. He was not, in his own accounting, a man who hit women. He was a man who operated in a unit where a certain type of conduct had become standard, where a certain level of pressure was acceptable and even rewarded, where the loudest voice tended to resolve ambiguous situations and the quiet ones were not wrong exactly, but negotiable. He'd been operating in that environment for 4 years, ever since he'd transferred to Redstone under Captain Doyle, who had since been promoted and transferred out, and was therefore entirely absent from whatever was about to happen to Kane. That last part kept surfacing. Doyle was gone. The culture Doyle had built remained. Kane had inherited it, operated within it, refined it slightly in the ways that felt natural to him. And now he was sitting in a holding area at 2230 with a rights form and a cold coffee while somewhere on this base, a woman he'd hit twice in front of 300 witnesses was writing a report that would determine the shape of the rest of his career. The duty officer, a first lieutenant named Gatch, who was 25 years old and looked younger, came out of the back room and stood across the table from him. Sergeant Kane, your counsel has been notified. JAG will see you at 0800. I know how this works, Lieutenant. Gatch looked at him, not with hostility, just with the neutral steadiness of someone who had decided this interaction wasn't going to become anything other than procedural. Is there anything you need tonight? Kane looked at the cold coffee. Fresh coffee would be good. I can do that. He brought it. Kane wrapped his hands around it and felt the warmth of the mug and stared at the table and tried to think about something other than her face. But her face kept being there. That absence of the reaction he'd expected, that terrifying professional stillness, The way she'd touched her cheek like she was noting a coordinate rather than checking whether she was hurt. He'd been in 2 deployments. He'd worked alongside people who had done things in places he hadn't been to, and he'd learned to identify a certain kind of person by a specific set of indicators that weren't obvious until you knew what to look for. Distance where there should have been anger, efficiency where there should have been adrenaline, a relationship with physical threat that looked less like courage and more like familiarity, which was a different thing entirely. He'd seen all of those things in her in the DFAC, and he'd chosen to dismiss them because dismissing them was easier. He turned the mug in his hands. You never needed to know my rank. You only needed to know what was right. He'd heard it in her exact voice at approximately 11-second intervals for the past 6 hours. 14 years. That was how long he'd been in. Long enough that it wasn't a career anymore. It was an identity, which was the point at which the difference between losing a career and losing yourself became academic. He put the mug down and picked up the rights form and read it a 13th time. At 0600, the base woke up in the way it always woke up. The PA system running the audio cue for morning formation, units moving across the parade ground in the gray pre-dawn. The smell of the dining facility starting up its first service, vehicles in the motor pool turning over. The ordinary mechanisms of a military post resuming their rhythm with no reference to what had happened the day before. Except that it wasn't ordinary. Anyone who'd been in the DFAC yesterday knew that. And anyone who hadn't been in the DFAC yesterday had received some version of the story from someone who had, which meant approximately the entire base had some awareness of it, filtered through whatever the teller's position and proximity had been. The versions varied. In one version, circulating primarily among E4s who'd heard it secondhand, the logistics specialist had put Kane through a wall and 6 MPs had been required to restore order. In another version, more accurate but still soft around the edges, she'd disabled 2 soldiers and been revealed as some kind of special operations asset who'd been watching the unit for months. In a third version, told by a corporal who'd actually been in the room and still sounded shaken by it, she'd done almost nothing. She'd just stood there, mostly, and let the room destroy itself around her. That third version was the closest to true, and it was the one that people found most unsettling, which was consistent with Maya's experience of how these things tended to land. She was in the command building by 0545, which was 15 minutes before anyone else on Hardaway's staff would arrive and 45 minutes before the briefing with Colonel Ferris. She used the time to run the assessment notes she'd been compiling for 3 weeks, through a structured review, cross-referencing the Kane incident against the pattern data she'd already documented, looking for threads she might have missed or weighted incorrectly. She found one. It was in the complaint log she'd pulled 2 weeks ago from the JAG office, not the Kane-specific record, which was short and contained 2 prior incidents that had been resolved informally, but the broader unit record, going back 30 months. There was a cluster of complaints from a specific time window set 14 months ago, roughly a quarter's worth, that had been filed and then withdrawn. 4 of them. The circumstances of the withdrawal were logged as resolved at unit level, which was a phrase that meant something and also meant nothing, depending on who had done the resolving. The names on those 4 complaints were not names she'd seen in any of her assessment notes. That meant they were gone, transferred out, ETS'd, or otherwise no longer on the installation. She wrote the 4 names down and pulled up the personnel tracking system. 3 transfers, 1 chapter, administrative. She looked at the dates on the transfers. 2 of them were within 60 days of the complaint withdrawal. She wrote 1 word next to each of those 2 names. When. Not why yet. Not enough data for why. But when was a question the data could answer, and when close enough together with withdrawal of complaint was its own kind of answer. She closed the personnel screen and wrote on a blank page, pattern, complaint, withdrawal, transfer. Sequence suggests incentivized withdrawal. She looked at the word incentivized and crossed it out. Put coerced instead. Then she looked at that and crossed it out too. She wrote, source unknown, motive unconfirmed, sequence does not rule out. That was more honest. She had a shape. She didn't yet have the inside of it. The door to the conference room opened and Hardaway came in with 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of her without asking, which was a calibration she appreciated. You've been here since 0545, he said. How do you know? Building access logs. She took the coffee. I found something in the JAG complaint record. He sat down. Tell me. She told him. She walked through the 4 complaints, the withdrawal dates, the transfer timing. She showed him the notation she'd made. She didn't use the word coerced, and she didn't use the word pattern. She said sequence and proximity, and let him draw whatever conclusions those words pointed to. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she watched him do the same math she'd already done, arriving at the same place. That goes above Kane, he said. Yes. How far above? I don't know yet. He looked at the page she'd written on. Ferris is going to ask. Tell him I don't know yet. That's the accurate answer. He won't like it. That's also accurate and also not relevant. Hardaway almost smiled. You've never briefed Ferris before. No, but I've briefed people like him. He's going to push. People always push. She picked up her coffee. That's fine. Pushing is data too. Outside the window, the base was fully awake now. Morning formation completed, units dispersing to their first tasks of the day. Somewhere out there, Tomas Arliss was starting his morning in whatever way he started mornings, carrying whatever he was carrying from the night before. Somewhere else, in processing, or in temporary quarters, or in the particular purgatory of military justice holding, Kane was sitting with whatever the night had left him. And somewhere above them all, in whatever altitude the complaint withdrawal transfer sequence pointed toward, someone was either unaware of what had happened in the DFAC yesterday, or was very aware of it and deciding right now what their next move needed to be. She was counting on the second option. The first option was solvable but slow. The second option was faster, because people who made next moves made mistakes, and mistakes were data, and data was the only thing she'd ever needed. Hardaway looked at the clock on the wall. 0712. 48 minutes, he said. I know. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. The same gesture she'd made with hers, she noticed, and wondered if he'd noticed it too. Maya. What? Be careful with Ferris. She looked at him. Why? He looked back at her, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before in their 3 weeks of working parallel. Something careful, something that had decided to be said and had decided it fast before he reconsidered. Because his name is on one of those 4 complaint files, he said, as the resolving officer. The room went very quiet. Maya set down her coffee and looked at the page where she'd written the 4 names and the notation about the sequence, and below it the words source unknown and motive unconfirmed, and she looked at them for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and drew a line through motive unconfirmed. She drew the line slowly, deliberately, the way you close a door you know you're not going to open again. Hardaway watched her do it. He didn't say anything. The coffee in his cup had stopped steaming. How long have you known? She asked. I found it this morning, 0430. Couldn't sleep, pulled the logs myself. He paused. I wanted to tell you before the briefing. Not before last night. I didn't know last night. She looked at him. He held the look without flinching, which told her something. Not everything, but something. Hardaway was uncomfortable in the way of a man who had stumbled into a situation larger than anticipated, not in the way of a man managing his exposure. She'd learned to tell the difference. The difference mattered. All right, she said. All right as in you believe me, or all right as in you're filing it? Both. She turned back to the page. Walk me through how you found it. He did. He'd gone into the JAG archive himself, pulled the unit complaint index for the past 36 months, run a search on resolving officer designations. Ferris's name appeared twice in the normal administrative capacity and once on the 4th complaint withdrawal, the one with the tightest timeline between filing and resolution. 41 hours from submission to withdrawal. The resolution notation was in Ferris's handwriting, scanned into the system. Matter resolved satisfactorily at unit level. No further action required. Colonel R. Ferris. 41 hours, she said. Yes. And the soldier who filed it. Transferred to Fort Drum 18 days later. She picked up her pen and wrote 41 hours next to the 4th name. Then she wrote Drum and circled it. Fort Drum is a long way from here, she said. Yes. Who authorized the transfer? Hardaway was quiet for 1 beat too long. Marcus? Ferris's office. he said. The authorization came out of Ferris's office. She set the pen down and looked at the window. The morning was full now. The sky past the command building roof a flat winter white, the kind of sky that gives nothing. No weather information, no warmth, just diffuse light with no source point. She'd worked in worse. She'd worked in places where the sky was the least of the problems. He's going to walk into this briefing in 41 minutes, she said, knowing that I know about Kane. Possibly knowing I've pulled the complaint records. Definitely knowing that whatever I've been documenting for 3 weeks is now informal evidence. Yes. And he doesn't know that you found the 4th complaint. Presumably not. Or that you told me. No, he doesn't know that. She looked at the page again. At the line through motive unconfirmed. At the 4 names and the dates and the sequence that wasn't a coincidence and had stopped looking like one 2 minutes ago. I need 40 minutes, she said. You have 39 now, I know. She was already reaching for her phone. Go get me whatever's in the JAG physical archive on the 4th complaint. Not the scan, the physical file. There'll be a copy with original signatures. They open the archive at, tell them it's command priority. Use my authorization level. He stood. They're going to ask what authorization level. She looked at him, and something in her expression answered the question in a way that made Hardaway not ask the follow-up. He left. She was already dialing. The call connected on the 2nd ring. The voice on the other end was male, slightly graveled in the way of someone who'd been awake longer than was ideal, and entirely alert in a way that suggested this was a normal condition. Cross. It went active yesterday, she said. Kane was the visible element. There's a 2nd layer. How deep? 06 at minimum. Possibly cleaner above that, possibly not. A pause on the line. Not hesitation, just processing. Timeline? Complaint suppression pattern going back 14 months. 4 incidents. At least 2 transfers used as management tools. You're sure? I'm sure of the sequence. I'm sure of the signatures. I'm working on the rest. You have the primary incident on record. Full documentation. 300 witnesses. Kane is in processing. The 06 doesn't know yet that I have the complaint files. Another pause. Longer. He's going to move. I know. That's what I need. Maya. What? If he's been running this for 14 months and he hasn't made a mistake that surfaced on its own, he's either careful or he has coverage. I know. Coverage above 06 means this gets complicated. It's already complicated. She was quiet for a moment. I need the PERSCOM access pulled on those 4 transfers within the next 30 minutes. Who authorized them, who countersigned, where the routing went, all of it. That's a wide pull. It's a necessary one. It'll flag. I know. Let it flag. If it flags, someone reacts. If someone reacts, I'll know which direction the coverage runs. The line was quiet. Outside, she could hear a vehicle moving in the lot below the window, tires on the cold pavement, the morning proceeding without reference to any of this. 30 minutes, the voice said. Thank you. She ended the call and put the phone face down on the table and looked at the 4 names on the page for a long moment, the way you look at a map when you've just figured out where you actually are, and it's further into uncertain territory than you'd planned. Colonel Raymond Ferris walked into the briefing room at 0800 exactly, which was a habit of his that everyone who worked with him knew and read as a dominant signal. Not early, which would suggest eagerness, not late, which would require an explanation, but exactly on time, which said the clock works around me. He was 61, 6 foot even, lean in the way of a man who'd maintained a physical standard his entire career and intended to make you aware of it. Silver hair, close cut. He wore his uniform the way men wear things they've stopped noticing, automatically, correctly, with no relationship to vanity. He had the kind of command presence that a certain type of officer develops over decades. Not louder than the room, just the gravitational center of it, the point that everything else organized around. He'd been at Redstone for 2 years and 2 months. He intended to be here for at most another 8 before the retirement package he'd been building toward made the arithmetic work. 8 months was a finite amount of time. Finite things were manageable. He looked at the table when he came in. Hardaway on the left side, which was expected. 2 individuals he didn't know, both in civilian clothes, both with the kind of stillness that said federal or adjacent. on the right side, which was not expected. A third chair between them, empty. He sat at the head of the table. "Where is she?" he said. "Coming, sir." Hardaway's voice was flat. Ferris looked at him. Hardaway was not a man who flattened his voice naturally. He was, in fact, one of the more expressive officers on his staff, which was something Ferris had noted and found only slightly irritating. The flatness now meant something. Ferris looked at the two civilians. Neither of them said anything. One of them had a tablet face down on the table in front of him. The other had nothing. That one was looking at the wall beside the window in the particular way of someone who had already decided how this room was going to go. The door opened. Maya Cross came in without rushing, which was its own form of punctuality. She was wearing her uniform, clean, no food on it, her sleeve intact, and she was carrying a folder and a coffee cup, and she moved to the empty chair and sat in it without any particular arrangement of herself, no performance of posture or arrival, just sat. "Colonel Ferris," she said. "Officer Cross?" He looked at her cheek, where the swelling from yesterday had settled into something visible, but no longer dramatic. "I hope you're recovering. I'm fine. I understand yesterday was disruptive." "Productive," she said. "Not disruptive." He looked at her for a moment. "I've read the incident report." "Which one?" Something moved behind his eyes. "Is there more than one?" "There's the one from the Provost Marshal's office covering the Kane incident. And there's my assessment documentation, which is ongoing," she paused. "And there's a third document which was submitted to PERSCOM this morning and which relates to the unit complaint record from the past 30 months. The room was quiet. Hardaway was looking at the table. The civilian with nothing in front of him was still looking at the wall. The one with the tablet had turned it over and was looking at a screen that Ferris couldn't see from where he sat. "I wasn't briefed on a third document," Ferris said. "It went through a separate channel." "What channel?" "The one that authorized my embedding at this installation." She opened the folder she'd brought and removed 3 pages, placing them on the table in front of her without sliding them toward him. "Colonel, I want to give you an opportunity to clarify something before this briefing proceeds." His expression didn't change, but something under it did. A minute tightening along the jaw, a stillness in the shoulders that hadn't been there 15 seconds ago. He had good control. She'd expected good control. Good control was data too. "I'm the senior officer in this room," he said. "You don't set the terms of my briefings." "That's correct in most contexts," she said. "In this context, my authorization supersedes installation rank structure. Lieutenant Colonel Hardaway can confirm that, and the 2 individuals to my right can also confirm it, along with their credentials if you'd like to see them." Ferris looked at the 2 civilians. The one with the tablet turned it to face him. He looked at what was on the screen. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Not long, but long enough. He looked back at Maya. "Ask your question," he said. His voice was the same. "That was impressive, actually." She filed it as impressive and moved on. 14 months ago, a specialist in your unit filed a formal complaint with the JAG office regarding command climate and improper conduct by an NCO. The complaint was withdrawn 41 hours after submission. You signed the resolution notation personally. She set the first page in the center of the table. 18 days after the withdrawal, the specialist was transferred to Fort Drum. The transfer was authorized out of your office. She set the second page next to the first. "I want to give you the opportunity to explain the sequence before I incorporate my current interpretation of it into the formal assessment record." "De mais was." Ferris looked at the 2 pages. He didn't touch them. "That was an administrative matter," he said, "handled at the appropriate level." The appropriate level being your personal involvement within 41 hours of filing. "I take command climate seriously." "I'm sure you do." She set the 3rd page down. It was the transfer authorization document bearing his office's routing stamp. The timeline between complaint withdrawal and transfer is 18 days. The regulation threshold for administrative transfer in non-disciplinary cases is 30 to 90 days depending on unit need. 18 days is below threshold. There was a unit need. What was it? A pause. "I don't recall the specifics of a personnel decision from 14 months ago. The justification on the transfer paperwork is listed as operational requirement, immediate. Fort Redstone's unit strength reports from that period Show no shortage at the receiving unit and no excess at this one. She tapped the third page. So I'm asking again, what was the operational requirement? The room had a quality now that rooms get when something has been said that can't be unsaid. A particular atmospheric change, like pressure dropping. The civilian with nothing in front of him had, without any visible transition, produced a small recording device and placed it on the table. Ferris looked at it. "This is being recorded," he said. Not a question. "This entire briefing is being recorded. Standard procedure for a formal assessment meeting." She paused. "It was stated in the scheduling notification, which you received yesterday at 1800. He looked at her. She looked back. This was the moment. She could feel the shape of it, where a certain type of person either committed to a position or found the lateral move, the way of exiting the direct line of the question and repositioning. She watched him make the calculation. She watched him decide. "I think," he said carefully, "that we should pause this briefing and consult with legal before proceeding." "You can do that," she said. "That's your right. The briefing will be rescheduled and the pause will be noted in the assessment record, along with the timestamp and the point in discussion at which it occurred." He was quiet. "Alternatively," she said, "you can answer the question and I'll note that you cooperated fully and provided clarification." A long moment. The fluorescent light in this room was better than the one in the DFAC. Newer, quieter, but it still had a buzz to it, and in the silence, it was suddenly the loudest thing in the room. "The specialist had performance issues," Ferris said finally. "The complaint was there were mitigating factors. The resolution was appropriate. The transfer was in the interest of unit cohesion." "Which specialist?" she said. Another pause. Shorter this time, but audible. "Excuse me? You said the specialist had performance issues. I've named 4 separate complaints in this period. Which specialist are you referring to?" He didn't answer. "Because I only told you about one," she said. "The 4th. I haven't mentioned the other 3. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from any of the preceding ones. It was the silence of a door that had been open and was now closed, and everyone in the room heard it close. Ferris looked at the recording device, then at the 2 civilians, then at Hardaway, who was still looking at the table, which was its own answer to whatever Ferris was asking with that look. Then he looked at Maya, and for the first time since he'd walked into the room, what was behind his expression wasn't control. It was something rawer and older than control, so like the look of a man who has been standing on a surface he believed was solid and has just felt it give. "I'd like to consult with legal," he said. "Of course." She closed the folder. "Interview suspended at 0817. She set it to the recording device, precise and clean. Then she looked at the civilian with nothing in front of him, who nodded. Ferris stood. He picked up nothing from the table because he'd brought nothing to the table. He moved toward the door with the careful walk of a man making sure his gait gives nothing away, and he almost managed it. At the door, he stopped. "Cross?" he said, without turning around. "Sir?" A pause. "How long have you actually been doing this?" She looked at the back of his head, the silver hair, the precisely cut neckline, the set of his shoulders under the uniform. "Long enough," she said. He left. Dad. The base didn't know what happened in that briefing room at 0817. It wouldn't know for several more hours, when the sequence of events would start to become visible in fragments. Ferris not appearing at the 9 o'clock staff sync, a JAG officer being seen entering the command building with a briefcase, 2 unfamiliar vehicles in the senior officer lot that nobody could account for. The pieces would accrue without resolution for most of the duty day, which was its own kind of pressure, the institutional equivalent of a sound you can't identify that keeps happening at irregular intervals. In the meantime, Fort Redstone ran. Morning PT accountability, unit training schedules, maintenance cycles. All of it continued because the machinery of a military installation is specifically designed to continue regardless of what's happening at the command level, which is sometimes a feature and sometimes exactly the problem. Thomas Arliss spent the morning in the motor pool, which was normal, doing inventory on a parts manifest that wasn't particularly urgent, which was also normal, and trying to behave as though the previous 18 hours had happened to someone else, which was not going well. He knew things he hadn't known 48 hours ago. That was the problem. Knowing things had a weight to it, a friction against the surface of ordinary tasks, and he kept losing his place in the parts manifest and having to start the line over. Sweeney appeared at his elbow at approximately 10:00 with 2 cups of coffee from the break room, which was thoughtful even if the coffee from the break room was terrible. "You know what's going on with the CO?" Sweeney said. "No." "True enough. Heard he didn't show to the 9 o'clock sync. People miss syncs. Ferris doesn't." Sweeney wrapped both hands around his cup and looked out the open bay door at the gray sky. Something's happening. Something's always happening. This is different something. Arliss looked at him. Sweeney was 24 from outside Baton Rouge, 3 years in, and he had the particular Louisiana quality of saying obvious things with absolute certainty as though the saying of them was itself a contribution. But he also had good instincts, which he rarely got credit for because his instincts came packaged in a lot of words that preceded them. "Yeah," Arliss said. "It is." Sweeney nodded like that settled it. "She did something. The woman from yesterday." "She's not the woman from yesterday." "I know, but I don't know her name." "Cross," Arliss said. "Her name is Cross." Sweeney drank his coffee. "Cross." He turned it over like he was checking it for something. "That's a name." "What does that mean?" "Nothing. Just, it's a name that has a thing to it." He looked at Arliss. "You talked to her." It wasn't a question. Arliss felt the small spike of something. Not fear exactly, more like exposure, the sensation of a thing you'd thought was private being visible. "Why would you think that?" "Because you've been off since last night, and you were fine. Relatively, until the end of chow. So something happened after chow." Sweeney shrugged. "And she's the only variable." "You're more observant than you act." "I act exactly as observant as I am," Sweeney said, which was either profound or absurd, and Arliss couldn't decide which. "What did she say to you?" "Not much. But something." Arliss set the parts manifest down. "She came to get the insignia back, the one I picked up in the DFAC." Sweeney absorbed this. And we talked for maybe 3 minutes, and she told me to sleep." "Did you?" "Eventually." Sweeney finished his coffee, set the cup on the nearest horizontal surface with the careful placement of someone who intended to retrieve it, and knew he wouldn't. "I looked it up," he said. "The marking. From what people described seeing on her arm." Arliss looked at him. "You can't look that up. Not officially, but there are forums." He said it with the slight self-consciousness of someone admitting to a habit they know isn't entirely sanctioned. "Military adjacent. People post things they've seen, things they've heard, description of a unit designation that doesn't correspond to any known structure. And most of what comes up is the usual conspiracy stuff, worthless. But there's a thread from about 7 years ago. Someone who was at a base in the Southwest described something similar. Said there were people who came and went without processing through normal channels. Said the base commander called one of them ma'am, and the person was wearing a specialist's uniform. Sweeney looked at him. Thread got taken down within 24 hours. The motor pool had its usual sounds around them. The clank of tools, the idle of a vehicle someone was warming up, radio chatter from 2 bays over. Ordinary bass noise. Arliss had been hearing it for 3 months, and it had never once felt like a backdrop to anything significant until right now. "Forums take things down for a lot of reasons," Arliss said. "Yeah." Sweeney picked up the cup he'd said he was going to retrieve. "They do." He walked back toward the break room, and Arliss watched him go, and then turned back to the parts manifest and stared at the line he'd lost his place on for the 5th time, and this time didn't try to find it. At 11:40, Maya was in the second-floor conference room when her phone vibrated with the PersCom data pull she'd requested at 0600. She read through it in 4 minutes, which was enough. The 4 transfer authorizations had a routing chain. 3 of them went through Ferris's office as expected. The 4th, the one for the specialist who'd filed the original complaint, the first one in the sequence 14 months ago, had a secondary countersignature. Not from Ferris, above Ferris. A brigadier general named Calloway, whose office was not at Fort Redstone but at the regional command level 2 installations away. She read the name twice, set the phone down, picked it up and read it again to make sure she'd read it correctly. She had. She put the phone face down on the table and sat back and looked at the ceiling for exactly 4 seconds, which was as long as she allowed herself for the thing she was feeling, which was not surprise. She'd told the voice on the phone it might go above 06, but was something adjacent to the moment before you step off something high, the recalibration of scale. Then she picked up the pen and opened the notebook and wrote, Callaway, BG, Regional Command, countersignature on transfer auth number 1. Routing confirms awareness. She looked at the word awareness and left it. Then she wrote below it, this is not a base problem. She underlined it once, closed the notebook, and reached for her phone again. The call connected on the first ring this time. It goes to Regional Command, she said. Callaway. The pause on the other end was longer than any previous pause. When the voice came back, it had a different quality. Not alarmed, but recalibrated, the way a conversation recalibrates when the magnitude of what's being discussed shifts by an order. Say again? Brigadier General Callaway, Regional Command, countersignature on the first transfer authorization. He knew about the complaint suppression at the point of origin. You're certain? I'm looking at his signature. Another long pause. Maya, this changes the scope of the operation. I know. This isn't a command climate assessment anymore. No, she said, it's not. I need to make some calls. I know, make them. She looked at the notebook, at the underlined line. But make them fast. Ferris went to legal at 0817. If Callaway is in contact with Ferris, he already knows something happened here. If he knows something happened, he's already deciding what to do about it. How much time do you think you have? She thought about the shape of a man like Callaway, the instincts of someone who had reached his rank by knowing when to contain things and how fast to move. The calculation she was making was the same one he was making right now, 200 miles away in a regional command office, except she'd had a head start. Not as much as I'd like, she said. I'll call you back in 20. Make it 15. She ended the call. Outside the window, the flat white sky had darkened slightly at the edges. Not clouds exactly, but the suggestion of weather coming. The kind of winter afternoon that arrives without announcement and makes everything feel closer and heavier than it was an hour before. She stood and walked to the whiteboard where she'd written Kane the night before, and below it source, and below that the bracket with the complaint sequence, all of which now looked like the visible part of something whose actual dimensions were considerably larger than she'd drawn. She erased it all. She stood with the eraser in her hand for a moment, looking at the clean white surface. Then she wrote one name, Callaway. And below it, nothing. Not yet. The 15 minutes came back as 12. She was still standing at the whiteboard when the phone vibrated against the table behind her. A single pulse, which was the signal they'd established for callback now, rather than when convenient. And she crossed the room and picked it up and was already talking before it reached her ear. Tell me. Callaway has been flagged in a separate investigation. The voice had the particular texture of someone reading from a screen while talking. Financial irregularities in procurement contracts. Regional command level, covering 3 installations including Redstone. The investigation has been running for 6 months out of the Inspector General's office. They didn't know about the complaint suppression. We didn't know about the procurement angle. She processed that in approximately 2 seconds. Separate teams. Completely separate. IG has their lane, we have ours. Neither one knew the other was working adjacent. Until now. Until now? A pause. Maya, the procurement irregularities are significant. We're talking about contracts routed through shell vendors, approval signatures that bypassed standard review, money that moved in ways that require a forensic accountant to trace. This isn't administrative sloppiness. This is deliberate. She looked at the name on the whiteboard. The complaint suppression was protecting the climate that protected the conduct that made the procurement fraud possible, she said. Soldiers who complained about command climate got transferred. Soldiers who got transferred couldn't testify to anything. Clean environment, no witnesses left at any given installation long enough to build a case. That's the working theory. It's not a theory, it's the structure. She pulled the chair out from the table and sat, because this was going to require her whole attention, and she'd learned not to pace through conversations that needed precision. Who at IG has the lead? Agent named Darrow, Petra Darrow. She's been running the procurement investigation since April. Does she know about Kane, about yesterday? She does now. We briefed her 40 minutes ago. And Calloway, does he know we have his signature on the transfer? Unknown. Ferris went to legal at 0817, and we have to assume contact between Ferris and Calloway happened shortly after. If Ferris told him about the briefing content, he did, she said. Ferris is not the kind of man who absorbs a shock and sits with it. He reached for the phone the moment he was out of that room. Then Calloway has had approximately 3.5 hours. 3.5 hours is enough time to decide a lot of things. She looked at the window. The sky had gone darker at the edges, the weather moving in from the northwest in the compressed way of winter systems that don't announce themselves. What's Calloway's current location? His office logged him at regional command as of 0800. He had a 9:30 external meeting that was canceled at 9:15. He canceled it, or it was canceled for him. A brief pause. His office canceled it. He's moving, she said, or he's making calls and deciding whether to move. She thought about the shape of a man who'd been running something like this for 14 months, careful enough to stay clean, careful enough to keep the transfers below threshold, careful enough to countersign one document, just one, and probably considered that one document a negligible risk because the soldier involved was gone and the file was closed. He'd been careful. Careful people, when surprised, either went very still or moved very fast, and the canceled meeting suggested movement. I need Darrow on a call, she said, in the next hour. I'm working on it. And I need someone watching Calloway's travel. If he comes toward Redstone, already flagged, you'll get a notification. Thank you. She ended the call and set the phone down and sat with the quiet for a moment. Not long, just a breath of it. The kind of pause that isn't rest, but is at least an acknowledgement that the landscape has changed and the map needs updating. Then she picked up the pen and opened the notebook to a clean page. At the top, she wrote, "What does Calloway need right now?" Below that, she wrote 3 things. To know what I have, to limit what becomes record, to establish distance from Ferret. She looked at the 3rd line. Calloway distancing from Ferris was predictable. Ferris was the exposed element, the one who'd been in the room, the one whose signature was on the document she'd placed on the table that morning. In a situation like this, a careful man shed the exposed element and moved to higher ground. The question was how he'd do it, how fast, and whether he'd try to do it through channels she could see or through ones she couldn't. She wrote one more line. He's going to come here. She wasn't certain of that, but she was close enough to certain that she wrote it without the question mark she usually used for working hypotheses. A man like Calloway didn't manage things from 200 miles away when those things had gotten to this point. He came in person. In person, he could read the room. In person, he could calibrate. In person, he had the weight of his rank, which was a tool he'd been using a long time and trusted more than he should. She wrote, "Arrival estimate, this afternoon. Latest by 1700. Then she closed the notebook and went to find Hardaway. She found him in the hallway outside the JAG suite on the building's ground floor, standing with the same lieutenant, Gatch, the young duty officer from the provost marshal's office, and a woman in a civilian suit that fit like it was meant to be taken seriously. The woman had a briefcase and short dark hair and the particular posture of someone who had been in uncomfortable meetings for a long time and had made peace with it. Hardaway looked up when Maya came around the corner. Something in his expression said he'd been waiting for her. "This is Agent Darrow," he said. "IG." Maya looked at Darrow. Darrow looked back. A direct, assessing look, not unfriendly, just professional. The kind of look that files you without broadcasting that it's filing you. "You work fast," Maya said. "I was already on my way here," Darrow said. "I got on the road at 0600. Your call just confirmed what I was already moving toward." "You had Redstone flagged." "Redstone was on the list. 3 installations. I was working them in sequence." She glanced at the door of the JAG suite. "I was going to be here next week. Your timeline accelerated mine." "That happens." Maya looked at Hardaway. "We need a space, not this floor." "Conference 2, he said. "Upstairs." "Get Gatch in there too," she said. Gatch, who had been standing slightly to the side in the practiced way of someone who'd learned that remaining unobtrusive near senior people was its own form of protection, straightened slightly. "You were on duty at the provost marshal's office last night." "Yes, ma'am." Kane said something to you, not in the official interview, before it, during processing. Something about who authorized the approach to the DFAC situation. Gatch hesitated. Ma'am, I'm not asking for a formal statement right now. I'm asking if he said something. Another hesitation, shorter. He mentioned Captain Doyle, former CO, transferred out 11 months ago. Said something about how things had been run a certain way since Doyle, and he cut himself off. Didn't finish it. But he started it. Yes, ma'am. She looked at Darrow. Darrow had a notebook out, actual paper, actual pen, which was a habit Maya recognized, and was writing something in small, quick script. Doyle, Darrow said, not looking up. Daniel Doyle, captain, transferred to Fort Bragg 14 months ago. She said it without searching, which meant she already knew the name. He's in the procurement file. Peripheral. We weren't sure if peripheral was meaningful or just proximity. It's meaningful, Maya said. Doyle built the climate. Calloway covered the climate. The climate covered the contracts. She moved toward the stairwell. Conference 2. 10 minutes. What? The meeting ran 90 minutes, which was 40 longer than Maya would have preferred, but Darrow had 6 months of procurement documentation, and some of it required walking through in sequence before the full shape of it was clear. By the time they finished, there were 17 pages of Darrow's small handwriting and 12 of Maya's own notes, and a dry erase board covered in names, dates, dollar amounts, and the routing chains that connected them in ways that were not accidental. What the board showed when they stepped back from it was a structure. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, nothing with a name or a manifesto, but the organic kind of corruption that grows in the space between oversight gaps, the kind that starts with one person deciding a rule is negotiable and ends with multiple people invested in keeping that negotiability invisible. Calloway was at the center of the procurement side. Doyle had been the installation-level executor, building the command climate that kept soldiers from raising issues through channels. Ferris had inherited and maintained that climate after Doyle transferred. The complaint suppressions were maintenance work. Not planned, but reflexive, the system protecting itself. Kane was the symptom. He'd always been the symptom. He had no idea about any of this, Darrow said, looking at Kane's name in the lower corner of the board. The contracts, the routing, he was just doing what the environment trained him to do. That's correct, Maya said. And it's relevant, but it doesn't change what he did. No, it doesn't. Hardaway was sitting at the far end of the table, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. He'd been largely quiet through the 90 minutes, contributing when asked, absorbing the rest. He looked like a man who had arrived at a destination he hadn't expected to reach. When this comes out, he said, not if, Maya noted, when the unit is going to be... He stopped. Disrupted, Maya offered. I was going to say lost. He looked at the board. These soldiers haven't done anything. Most of them. They've just been living inside a structure that was rotten, and they didn't know it. Some of them knew something was off, Maya said. Not the contracts, but the climate, the pattern of who got transferred, who stopped complaining. Some of them registered it and decided it wasn't their problem. That's different from being complicit. Yes, it is. She looked at the board too. The unit will be disrupted. Leadership structure will change significantly, but the soldiers aren't the target. They were never the target. Hardaway nodded slowly. Kane. Kane gets prosecuted for what Kane did. That doesn't change based on what we found today. It just contextualizes it. Does he know? Hardaway asked. About Calloway? The contracts? No, Darrow said. He doesn't know any of that exists. He's going to be very confused about why this is happening the way it's happening. He struck a commissioned officer twice, Maya said. He knows why something is happening. The scope of it will be a surprise. The room settled into a brief quiet. Through the window, the sky had gone fully gray, and the first suggestion of precipitation was visible. Not snow, not rain, something in between, the kind of winter weather that couldn't commit. The vehicles in the lot below had their windshields beating. Maya's phone vibrated. She looked at it. One line. Calloway's vehicle left Regional Command at 11:03. ETA Redstone approximately 14:30. She showed it to Darrow, who looked at it and then at her watch. 2.5 hours, Darrow said. 2 hours 20. He's coming here to manage it. Yes. Darrow looked at the board. If he walks in here and invokes rank, he can invoke whatever he wants, Maya said. He countersigned a transfer authorization on a soldier who had filed a complaint that Ferris suppressed. That signature is in the record. That's not manageable by invoking rank. He might not know that we have that document. He'll know by now. Ferris's legal consultation. Right. Darrow closed her notebook. We need to have the IG formal authorization on the table before he arrives. If he comes in claiming this is an internal army matter, I'll handle the authorization. Maya, Darrow looked at her directly. He's a general officer. The moment he walks in this building, the air pressure changes. I've been in rooms with him before. When? 18 months ago. Regional command review. He has a way of making the thing that's happening feel like it's happening on his terms, even when it isn't. She paused. I'm not saying he'll succeed. I'm saying he'll try it, and it'll take a moment before it stops working, and in that moment, people make accommodations they regret. Maya looked at her. I've been in rooms with men like him for a long time. I know. I'm just saying, I know you are. She picked up her pen and wrote something at the bottom of her notebook page, tore it off, and pushed it across the table to Darrow. These are the 3 documents that need to be formally logged through IG before 1430. In that order. The third one is the PERSCOM pull with his counter-signature. Once it's in the IG system, it's part of the federal record, and he can't ask anyone to remove it. Darrow looked at the page. I can do this in an hour. You have 2. Darrow stood, picked up her briefcase, and moved toward the door with the specific purposefulness of someone who had been waiting for a clear task in a situation full of unclear ones. At the door, she stopped. Where do you want to meet him when he arrives? Maya thought about it for 2 seconds. Here. This room. Not the command suite? Here. He'll expect the command suite. Coming here is a small displacement, small enough that he can't object to it, large enough that it takes him a moment to adjust. She looked at the whiteboard with his name on it. I want him slightly off the surface he expects to be standing on. Darrow looked at the board too. Right, she said, and left. Hardaway stood. He looked at Maya, then at the board, then back at her. Is there anything you need from me? Yes. I need you to get me Kane's full service record, not the summary, the complete file. Every duty station, every evaluation, every commendation, and every flag. That'll take a couple hours. That's fine. Can I ask why? She picked up her coffee, which was also cold, and drank it anyway. Because when this is over, someone is going to have to make a recommendation about what happens to him. And I'd rather make that recommendation with the complete picture than without it. Hardaway absorbed that. You're going to recommend mitigation. I'm going to recommend what the complete picture supports. I don't know what that is yet. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone deciding whether to say something. He decided. Yesterday, after the DFAC, a lot of people in this unit figured you for someone who was going to leave Kane in a hole and walk away. I know. The way you handled it, it didn't look like... He stopped. It looked efficient, not personal. It wasn't personal. That's what I mean. He turned the cold coffee cup in his hands. Most people, if someone hit them like that, there'd be something personal to it. Even if they handled it professionally, there'd be a heat somewhere. She looked at him. There is heat. I just know where to put it. She set her cup down. Get me the service record, Marcus. He went. Kane's service record arrived at 13:10, delivered by a staff sergeant from the personnel office who knocked twice and left it without commentary. Maya sat with it for 40 minutes. 14 years was a long time. The early portion of the record showed someone who'd been good at the job. Genuinely good. Not the performed competence of someone chasing evaluations, but the substantive record of a soldier who had tested well, trained effectively, earned commendations that corresponded to actual performance outcomes. 2 deployments with solid after-action records. A physical fitness score that had stayed consistently high. An NCO who'd been recommended for additional responsibility by 3 consecutive commanders in the first 8 years. Then Redstone. Then Doyle. The evaluations didn't change dramatically. They never did in situations like this. Because evaluations were written by the same command structure that was doing the damage, which made them evidence of the problem rather than an accurate record of the person. But there were small things, if you knew how to read for them. The language in the later evaluations was slightly more template-heavy, slightly less specific. The commendations stopped reflecting operational outcomes and started reflecting interpersonal ones, commands with authority, maintains unit discipline, the kind of language that praised a style of behavior rather than an outcome of it. She made a note. Pre-Redstone records suggest developmental potential not consistent with current conduct. Environmental influence significant. Not exculpatory. Relevant for disposition recommendation. She closed the file. At 1350, her phone vibrated. Calloway's vehicle on base. Eastgate. ETA conference building, 8 minutes. She stood, checked her uniform. Not from vanity, from the same instinct that made her keep her handwriting level under stress, a baseline she maintained so that pressure couldn't degrade it, and moved to the window. The precipitation had stopped, leaving the pavement outside dark and reflective, every surface wet and specific in the flat winter light. She could see the east road from this window, and after 30 seconds she could see the vehicle. A dark staff car, moving at the pace of someone who had somewhere to be but was not going to appear to hurry. She turned from the window and sat at the head of the table. She put the Kane service record on the table in front of her. She put the notebook to her left. She put her pen on the notebook and her phone face down beside it. Then she put her hands on the table, palms down, and looked at the door. 8 minutes later, it opened. Brigadier General Warren Calloway was 63 years old and had been in the Army for 38 of them, which meant that for the past 38 years, rooms had rearranged themselves when he entered them. Not through any particular performance on his part. It was deeper than performance. It was habit. It was the accumulated physical fact of 38 years of rooms rearranging. He was not a tall man, not a particularly large one, but he occupied his size completely. And the uniform carried its own architecture. The star, the service record on his chest, the way he wore it all like weather. He came into the conference room with an aide behind him, a captain who looked like a recent West Point graduate and who had the face of someone following a plan he'd been briefed on and was now discovering the briefing hadn't fully covered. And he stopped when he saw Maya. He'd expected more people in the room. She could tell. A small recalibration happened, quick and controlled, but visible if you were looking for it. "Officer Cross," he said. "General Calloway." She didn't stand. "Thank you for coming." A pause. He looked at the room, the whiteboard with his name on it, the folders on the table, the Kane service record. He looked at all of it in approximately 2 seconds. "I expected this to be a joint meeting. I was told Agent Darrow. Agent Darrow will join us shortly. She's completing a filing." "What filing?" "The documentation for my assessment, routed through IG." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "Please sit down, sir." He sat. The aide moved to stand against the wall, which Calloway waved off with a small gesture, outside, and the aide went, pulling the door closed behind him, which meant Calloway wanted this without a witness on his side. She noted that. It meant he was still deciding which version of this meeting he was going to run. "I drove 2 hours and 20 minutes, he said. "I know, I appreciate it. I came because I understand there's been a significant incident here, and I want to ensure it's being handled appropriately." "It is." He looked at her. "You're very calm." "I'm usually calm." "I've heard that." He said it in a way that suggested the hearing had not been recent and had not been casual. "I've made some inquiries this morning about the program you operate under." "I know." "You know." The inquiries flagged. That's standard. She looked at him steadily. "What did you find out?" He turned the thought over before answering, enough to understand that this is more complicated than a command climate assessment. It always was. The Kane incident is documented and in processing. That's not why you drove 2 hours. He looked at her for a moment. He had steady eyes, not warm, not cold exactly, but settled. The eyes of a man who had learned to let things pass through his expression without leaving marks. "No," he said. "It's not. You drove because Ferris called you." No denial. "Ferris informed me of the briefing content this morning. And you were concerned." "I was—" He stopped, chose a different word. "I wanted to understand the scope of what was being assessed." The scope is Fort Redstone. That's what I was authorized for. She opened the notebook to the page with the 4 names. During the course of that assessment, I identified a pattern in the complaint record that indicated active suppression. 4 complaints over 14 months. I pulled the personnel records on the associated transfers. She pushed the page toward him. Not the notebook, just the page, torn clean. I found your countersignature on the first transfer authorization. He looked at the page. He looked at it longer than Ferris had looked at anything that morning, which told her something about the difference between them. Ferris had looked away because he was caught. Calloway looked at it with the deliberate attention of someone reading a document he hadn't seen in a while and remembering it completely. That transfer was within my authority, he said. Yes, it was within your authority. The question is whether it was appropriate exercise of that authority given the context. The context being that the soldier involved had filed a formal complaint with JAG 41 hours before the transfer was authorized and 18 days before it was executed, and that the complaint was resolved, not investigated, resolved, by Colonel Ferris with no formal inquiry. Unit-level resolution is a standard, sir. She said it evenly, without inflection, just the word, a full stop. You countersigned a transfer authorization on a complaining soldier 18 days after the complaint was suppressed by your subordinate. That's the document. That's the sequence. She looked at him. I'm not asking you about your authority. I'm asking you whether you knew about the complaint when you countersigned. The room was very quiet. Calloway put the page down. He folded his hands on the table, not nervously, but deliberately, the gesture of a man preparing for a long negotiation. I think, he said, that this conversation should have legal present. Agent Darrow is the legal presence. She'll be here and... She looked at the door as it opened. Darrow came in with the briefcase and sat down without preamble, setting a folder on the table and opening it. She looked at Calloway once, directly, then at Maya. It's filed, she said. Thank you. Calloway looked at Darrow. Something in his posture had changed. Not collapsed, not visibly, but shifted, the way a structure shifts when a load-bearing point gives slightly. He recognized her. He'd been in a room with her before, 18 months ago, and he knew what the briefcase meant and what the folder meant and what its filed meant. Agent Darrow, he said. General. Her voice was entirely neutral. He looked at the folder, then at Maya, then at the whiteboard with his name on it, then at the window, where the wet pavement outside was reflecting the gray sky back at itself in a flat, mirrorless way. The procurement investigation, he said. Not a question, not quite a statement either. Something in between. The verbal equivalent of a man testing weight on uncertain ground. Among other things, Darrow said. How long? 6 months. He absorbed that. 6 months was a specific amount of time. It meant the investigation had started before yesterday. Before Kane. Before any of this had become visible. It meant he hadn't been as clean as he'd thought. It meant the complaint suppression was a thread that had been available to pull even without yesterday's incident, and that yesterday had simply accelerated what was already in motion. Maya watched him arrive at that conclusion in real time. She watched the moment he got there. What happens now? He said. His voice had changed. Not broken. He hadn't broken, and she hadn't expected him to. But the register had shifted. The authority claim was gone from it. What was left was something more basic, more human, the voice of a man in his 60s who had built something over 38 years and was sitting in a wet pavement gray afternoon figuring out how much of it was still standing. That depends on a number of things, Darrow said. The scope of the procurement matter is still being determined. Your cooperation. I'm not making any agreements without counsel. Of course not. That's your right. But I'm asking what... He stopped, started again. In terms of the installation, these soldiers, the unit. Maya looked at him. It was a genuine question. She could tell the difference, and this was genuine. The unit will be disrupted. Leadership structure will change. The soldiers who've been here operating in good faith will receive clarification of what was happening around them. She paused. They deserve that. He was quiet. His hands were still folded on the table, but the deliberateness was gone from the gesture. They were just hands now, older than they looked in the uniform, resting on a table. I made a decision 14 months ago, he said, that I told myself was administrative. I know. It was more than administrative. I know. He looked at her. A long, direct look. The kind that doesn't bother with performance because there's nothing left to perform for. You're not going to tell me it'll be all right. No, she said. I'm not. He nodded once. It was a small nod, barely visible, the kind that doesn't mean agreement so much as receipt. Received, understood, in the record. I'd like to call my counsel now, he said. The aide outside can help you with that, Maya said. Take whatever time you need. He stood. He straightened his uniform by reflex, the habit of 38 years, automatic as breathing, and walked to the door and opened it and stepped out. And the door closed, and the room was quiet again with just Maya and Darrow and the whiteboard and the gray light coming through the window. Darrow exhaled, not dramatically, just the controlled release of someone who had been holding something in for the duration of the meeting. That went better than I expected, she said. He's intelligent, Maya said. Intelligent people, when they run out of moves, usually stop making them. Usually. Darrow looked at the board. What about Ferris? Ferris will fight it longer than Calloway. He's closer to it, more invested in a specific outcome. She closed the notebook. But it won't change the record. No. Darrow looked at the Kane service record still on the table. And Kane? Maya picked it up. She looked at the cover page. 14 years of service compressed into a number and a name. Kane gets prosecuted for what Kane did, she said. But I'm going to write the disposition recommendation tonight. She put the file under her arm. All of it, the full picture. Darrow looked at her. That's not required. I know. She moved toward the door. It's right. Outside, through the window, the wet pavement was starting to dry at the edges, the water retreating from the warmest surfaces first, leaving the shadows still dark and the rest returning slowly to its ordinary color. The aide was standing in the hallway with his phone out. Calloway was 20 feet away, speaking quietly into his own phone, his back to the conference room. His voice too low to hear through the glass, but his posture readable. Not the posture of a man making excuses, but the flattened, deliberate posture of a man stating facts to someone who needed to hear them. Thomas Arliss, 2 buildings away in the motor pool, would not know any of this had happened today until much later. When he found out, piecing it together from fragments, the way news moves through a military installation sideways and in layers, he would think about the night she'd come to his bunk and taken back the insignia and told him to sleep. And he would understand, finally, that she'd known even then how large this was going to get. And she'd stood at a whiteboard in the dark and written one name on it like she was placing a marker on a map. Not the endpoint, just the next coordinate. She'd always known there were more. She finished the disposition recommendation at 2240. It was 11 pages. That was longer than it needed to be, and she knew it, but she'd written it the long way deliberately. Not padding, but completeness. The kind of document that couldn't be summarized down to a single outcome without losing the thing that made the outcome make sense. She wanted whoever read it after her to understand the whole shape. The early service record, the Redstone transfer and what came after it, the environmental factors that didn't excuse the conduct, but that were real and documented and relevant to what happened to a person next. She recommended prosecution on the assault charges. That was non-negotiable, and she hadn't spent more than 30 seconds on it. Kane had struck a commissioned officer twice in front of 300 witnesses and directed subordinates to physically remove her. The record was clean on that, and the recommendation matched it. She also recommended that the court-martial review include the full environmental context, the command climate assessment findings, the documented pattern of conduct that had been tolerated and therefore implicitly endorsed, the 14-month timeline of complaint suppression that had created the conditions in which someone like Kane could operate the way he had without meaningful correction. Not as mitigation that reduced the charge, as context that informed the disposition, and, more importantly, informed what the Army did with the information about the system that had produced him. The last page was the hardest to write. She wrote it 3 times before it said what she meant. Recommendation. Following resolution of criminal proceedings, subject be evaluated for potential continuation of service under restructured command assignment with mandatory remediation protocol. Pre-Redstone service record indicates developmental capacity inconsistent with current conduct. Institutional environment was a significant contributing factor. This does not diminish individual accountability. It does suggest that accountability and development are not mutually exclusive outcomes in this case, and that the institution has an interest in both. She read it back. It still felt incomplete, which was honest because it was incomplete. She didn't know how a court-martial would land on Kane. She didn't know if he had anything in him that the earlier record had suggested, or if Redstone had changed something that couldn't be changed back. She didn't know, and she'd written it anyway, because the alternative was writing only what she was certain of, and certainty in a case like this was a way of being less honest than the situation required. She closed the document and sent it through the secure channel. Then she sat in the dark conference room for a few minutes. The overhead light off, the window showing the base at night, the parade ground lights, and the distant motor pool, and the outline of the barracks against a sky that had cleared after the afternoon's indeterminate weather, and was now showing stars in the gaps between the remaining cloud cover. She was tired, not physically, or not only physically, but in the specific way that comes from sustained precision work, from keeping your calibration exact under pressure for an extended period. It was the tiredness of a long task completed, and it had a different texture from the ordinary kind. She picked up her phone. No new notifications. Calloway's counsel had arrived at 1600, and the formal interview with IG had been scheduled for 0900 the following morning. Ferris was still in legal consultations. Kane was still in processing, which would continue until the JAG office opened for his formal advisement in the morning. The base was quiet. 2 days ago, she hadn't existed to any of these people. Now she'd been the center of something that had changed the shape of the installation in ways that would be visible for months. She'd move on before those changes fully resolved. That was the nature of the work. You were present for the catalyst and absent for the aftermath. And you learned not to be bothered by that, or you learned to convincingly act like you weren't. She wasn't always sure which one was true of her. She stood, stretched her shoulders, turned off the light, and went to bed. She was up at 5:30, not from obligation. The formal schedule didn't require her until the Calloway interview at 9, but because 5:30 was when she had woken up for years, a body clock calibration that had outlasted every assignment and every time zone and showed no sign of negotiating. She ran 4 miles on the perimeter road in the cold dark, which was uncomfortable and necessary, and cleared something in her head that sitting in conference rooms and writing 11-page documents couldn't touch. When she came back, Arliss was standing outside the barracks in his PT gear, doing the same. Not together. She was finishing her run and he was starting his, and they intersected at the corner of the barracks access road in the gray pre-dawn. He stopped when he saw her. She slowed. "Private? Ma'am?" He looked at her for a moment, taking in the running shoes, the civilian jacket, the fact that she was out here at 5:30 like a regular person. "You run every morning?" "Most mornings." "Yeah." He shifted. "Me too." They stood at the intersection for a moment in the cold, their breath visible. Somewhere across the base, the first kitchen staff was arriving at the DFAC for the early prep shift. A vehicle moved through the main road without hurrying. "Is it done?" he asked. She looked at him. "Most of it." "Calloway." She didn't ask him how he knew the name. The installation had been talking for 24 hours, and Arliss was observant in the quiet way that was more useful than the loud kind. "His formal interview is this morning." He nodded. Then, "Kane." "In processing. Court-martial proceeding will start next week." He nodded again. He was looking at the parade ground, not at her. "People in the unit are... There's a lot of different things being said." "I know. Some of them are angry." He said it carefully, like he was checking whether it was safe to say. "Not at you specifically, at the idea that we were being watched, evaluated." "That's a reasonable response." "Is it?" He looked at her now. "I keep thinking, if the evaluation wasn't happening, if you weren't here, Kane just keeps doing what Kane was doing, and the people who filed complaints keep getting transferred, and Calloway keeps..." He stopped. "And nothing changes." "Yes. So the watching, the embedded part, it bothers people because it feels like a violation, but the alternative is worse." She looked at him. He was 20 years old and had been in the Army for less than a year and was working through something that people twice his age and experience routinely refused to work through because working through it was uncomfortable. "That's the tension," she said. It doesn't resolve. You just have to decide which discomfort you can live with. He thought about that. Which one do you live with? She was quiet for a moment. I live with the one where I was present, she said. The other kind. Where I wasn't there, where nothing changed. I've seen what that looks like. I'd rather carry what I carry. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, the specific nod of someone who isn't fully satisfied but has gotten the honest answer, which is different and better. Go run, she said. He went. She watched him for a second. The young man's gait, the cold morning, the parade ground opening up ahead of him, and then turned back toward the command building. Operative. The Calloway interview ran 3 hours. He came in with counsel, which was expected, and the counsel spoke more than Calloway did in the first 40 minutes, which was also expected. Darrow ran the IG side with the methodical patience of someone who had been doing this for long enough that impatience was no longer part of her available register. Maya sat to Darrow's left and said almost nothing for the first hour. She said almost nothing because she didn't need to. The documents did the work. The PERSCOM pull with the countersignature, the transfer authorization with his routing stamp, the procurement contract routing chains, which Darrow laid out with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who had spent 6 months building a case and was now presenting it to the person at the center of it. Each document placed on the table with its own silence, its own specific weight. Calloway's counsel objected at several points. The objections were professionally framed and largely accurate. There were procedural questions, chain of custody questions, scope questions, and Darrow addressed each one without dismissing it, which was the right approach because dismissing them would have given them more energy than they deserved. At the 2-hour mark, Calloway asked his counsel to step out. That was the moment Maya had been waiting for. Not because she needed it, the documents were sufficient without any statement from him, but because it told her something about the kind of person was sitting across from her, something that hadn't been visible yet in the careful management of the past 2 hours. He looked at her. Not at Darrow, at her. The 4 soldiers who were transferred, he said. The ones who filed the complaints. Yes. I want to know if they're going to be made aware of what's come out, what was happening. Maya looked at him. It was a genuine question. She could tell again the difference. That's part of the remediation process. Yes, they'll be notified. And the transfers, those are on their records. The IG investigation can support a record review for each of them, Darrow said. If the transfers are found to be retaliatory, they were retaliatory, Calloway said. Flat. No hedging. His counsel would have objected, but his counsel was outside. I knew what I was doing. I told myself it was management. It wasn't management. He looked at the table. I'd like that record review to happen, whatever the process is. Neither Maya nor Darrow said anything for a moment. That can be included in the cooperation agreement, Darrow said, if you're indicating willingness to cooperate. I'm indicating that those 4 people deserve to have their records corrected. He looked up. The rest of it, the cooperation, the agreement, all of that, my counsel handles. But the record review is not a negotiating point. It should happen regardless. Maya wrote something in the notebook. She wrote it without looking up. Calloway request, personnel record review for 4 complainants, independent of cooperation status. Then below it, document and process. She pushed the notebook toward Darrow, who read it and nodded. We'll process it independently, Darrow said. Calloway looked at Maya again. You're not going to say anything. You said what needed to be said. You could have pushed, used it as leverage. Yes. She looked at him steadily. I'm not interested in leverage. I'm interested in the outcome. He held the look for a moment. Then, what happens to the unit? The soldiers who were here operating, normally, who didn't know. New leadership structure will be in place within 30 days. Hardaway stays. He's clean, he's capable, and the unit knows him. She paused. They'll be disrupted. It won't be seamless, but they'll have leadership they can trust, which is more than they had before. He was quiet. And you? I'll be gone by Friday. He looked like he was going to say something else. He didn't. He called his counsel back in, and the interview proceeded into its 3rd hour, and by the time it concluded, there was enough on the record to support the IG investigation's expansion, and enough cooperation indicated that the formal agreement process could begin. It wasn't clean. None of these things were clean, but it was done. She left Fort Redstone on a Friday morning, which was what she'd told Calloway, and which was accurate, though she hadn't expected it to feel the way it felt when she walked out of the command building with one bag and the same unremarkable uniform she'd arrived in 26 days ago. Hardaway walked her to the car. He didn't need to. There was no protocol requiring it, and he had a 9 o'clock staff sync that he was now going to be late for. But he did it anyway, and she let him, because some things didn't need a reason. At the car, he said, "We're going to be a mess for a while." "I know." "The unit is going to be angry and confused and—" "Marcus?" She looked at him. "You know how to lead people through angry and confused. You've done it before. That's why you're here." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been told something true that he hadn't fully believed about himself. It was a complicated expression to be on the receiving end of. "You think I didn't notice your file," she said. "My file is—" "Your file shows someone who was transferred here 8 months ago after flagging a command climate concern at his previous installation. Through proper channels. Which went nowhere." She held his look. "The concern was logged. The flag was part of the data I reviewed when I was assigned here." A pause. "You flagged it anyway, even when it went nowhere. That's on your record and it doesn't look like nothing." He was quiet for a long moment. The base morning was proceeding around them. Vehicles, personnel, the routines of an installation that was still running its rhythms even while something significant was working its way through the institution's interior. "I thought I was being managed out," he said. "You were being managed sideways," she said. "There's a difference. You're still here." He looked at the car. "What do I tell them? The soldiers. When they ask about what happened. About you." She thought about it. "Tell them the truth. Tell them someone was sent here to look at how this unit was being run, and what she found was more than she expected, and it's going to take time to work through. Tell them that none of what happened is their fault, and all of what comes next is their responsibility." She picked up the bag. "That's enough truth for now. The rest will come out through the process." "And Kane?" She put the bag in his car. "Tell them Kane was a good soldier who got lost in a bad system and made choices that the system made easier than they should have been, and that neither of those things are the whole story, and both of them are true." Hardaway looked at her. "That's going to be hard to say." "Yes, say it anyway." She got in the car. He stood at the side of it for a moment, not quite ready to step back, not quite ready to speak, and then he put his hand briefly on the roof of the vehicle, a small gesture that wasn't a salute and wasn't a handshake, just contact, just acknowledgement, just, "I'll remember this." Then he stepped back, and she drove. The gate guard checked her out. Processing documentation at the main gate, with the particular neutral efficiency of someone performing a routine function with no knowledge of what the person in the vehicle had been doing for the past 26 days. She was a specialist leaving the installation. Her paperwork was in order. The gate opened. She drove out onto the state road and let the base recede in the mirror. She didn't have a destination yet. That was normal. Between assignments, there was usually a brief window of unstructured time that she used differently depending on what the assignment had required. Sometimes she drove. Sometimes she found a motel somewhere unremarkable and slept for 14 hours. Sometimes she called her sister, who lived outside of Nashville and had 2 kids under 7 and existed in a world so different from Maya's that the phone calls were both completely comfortable and completely disorienting, which was itself a form of rest. She thought about calling her sister now. She thought about what she'd say if her sister asked how the past month had been. Fine. Eventful. I got hit twice in a lunchroom, and it turned out to be connected to a procurement fraud scheme that's going to result in a general officer's career ending, and I wrote an 11-page document recommending that a man who hit me twice should be evaluated for continuation of service because his pre-Redstone record suggested he was capable of more than what he became, and I'm still not sure if that was the right call, but I made it, and it's in the record, and I'd make it again. How are the kids? She almost laughed. She didn't quite, but almost. The road ran northeast through flat winter country, fields that had been harvested and were now showing stubble through the light frost, tree lines bare and precise against the sky, the occasional farmhouse set back from the road with smoke coming from a chimney. Ordinary landscape, ordinary Friday. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. A message from a number that wasn't saved in her contacts but that she recognized. Transfer notification. New assignment. Details following. 72 hours stand down first. She read it twice. 72 hours, 3 days. She hadn't had 3 consecutive unstructured days in 11 months. She put the phone face down on the seat and looked at the road. Thomas Arliss would be in the motor pool this morning, working through a parts manifest or not working through it, depending on what the news cycle of the installation had delivered before noon. He would piece together what had happened over the following weeks through the official channels and the unofficial ones, and he would arrive at some version of understanding that was approximately accurate and somewhat incomplete, which was the way most people understood most things that happened around them. He would be fine. She was fairly sure of that. Not certain, you were never certain about people, but fairly sure. He had the quality she looked for when she looked at people, which was not courage exactly and not intelligence exactly, but something that operated underneath both of them. The willingness to sit with a thing that didn't have a clean answer and keep sitting with it until something honest came through. He'd asked her which discomfort she lived with. She lived with presence, with being the person in the room, the one who showed up before the mission was named, who absorbed the contact and sent the signal and wrote the report and drove out through the gate when it was done. She lived with the fact that she would never be able to fully explain any of this to most people. Not because it was secret, some of it was, but not all, but because there was no clean way to describe a life organized around being unseen until the exact moment that being seen was what the situation required. She lived with the fact that she'd let Kane hit her twice because one contact wasn't enough for the record. That one she'd never fully resolved. She thought she'd made the right call. She also knew that right and easy to carry were different categories, and she'd stopped expecting them to overlap. The road curved north, and the sun came out from behind the cloud cover for the first time all morning, throwing flat winter light across the frozen fields and the bare trees and the dashboard in front of her. And she squinted against it and didn't reach for her sunglasses, just let her eyes adjust. 72 hours. She thought about Nashville. She thought about her sister's voice on the phone, the background noise of 2 kids under 7 doing whatever 2 kids under 7 did on a Friday morning. She thought about the kind of ordinary that was genuinely foreign to her now. Not alienating exactly, just foreign, the way a language you understood but didn't speak felt in your mouth when you tried to use it. She thought she might go anyway. She picked up the phone and dialed. It rang twice. "Hey!" Her sister's voice, warm and slightly distracted, the sound of someone doing 3 things at once. "I was wondering if you'd fallen off the planet. I was busy." "You're always busy. Are you okay?" She thought about the question, about its actual content, about what okay meant and didn't mean, and whether the word was adequate to the range of things a person could be after 26 days at Fort Redstone. "I'm driving," she said. "Where?" "I thought I might come to Nashville." A pause, then warmly, "The kids are going to lose their minds." "I know. You have to actually play with them this time. You can't just sit in the corner and watch them like they're a threat assessment." She almost laughed again, and this time she did. It was a small laugh, imperfect, not quite what laughter was supposed to sound like, but real. "I'll try." "That's not a promise." "No," she said. "It's not." Her sister made the sound she always made, the mixture of exasperation and acceptance that had been her signature response to Maya since approximately childhood. "Fine. Drive safe. There's food." She ended the call and set the phone down and put both hands on the wheel. Fort Redstone was 20 miles behind her now. The Callaway interview was on record. The Kane proceedings were in motion. 4 soldiers' personnel files were pending review, and the transfers that had followed their complaints would be re-examined, and whatever the examination found would be documented and processed and entered into a system that was imperfect and slow and occasionally broken in ways that required someone to go looking for the break before anyone else noticed it was there. She had been the someone, this time. She would be the someone again in 72 hours, at a place whose name she didn't know yet, inside a situation whose shape she couldn't see yet, wearing a uniform that announced nothing about her. But not today. Today the road ran north through the winter fields and the sun was out, and she had a tank full of gas, and her sister's voice was still in her ear saying there's food. And that was, right now, more than enough. The most dangerous thing a system can do is convince the people inside it that what they're enduring is simply how things are. It isn't. Someone always notices. The question is whether they're willing to say so, and whether anyone is listening when they do.